to today's Discover Data DX event. We're going to explore together what exactly Data DX is, and then we will hear from a number of companies that are at the forefront of defining this new category. You've chosen to join this event today because you're a software developer or a PM or has some other relationship to the software development industry. And I want to step back for a moment and just reflect on where we are as an industry. We're going through this very profound moment in time where software is taking over the entire world. Software is now part of everything we do, and that means not only software developers and computer scientists are writing applications. So in the early days of my career, I made a choice to switch from application development to be on the infrastructure team that would build internal tooling for the other application developers to be more efficient. And during this time, I developed a North Star goal. I wanted databases to become more like creating a page in Notion and less like this magical Jenga tower you had to babysit just for it to work. And to me, that's really what Data DX is all about. I want to get rid of all of that complexity. I want specialized teams to work with that so that the rest of us can focus on the applications we want to build for end users. And now, to get us started exploring Data DX, I'm going to sit down with our very own Head of Developer Connections, Petra, to ask her some questions about what Data DX means to her. What is Data DX to you?
For me, Data DX is sort of that basic concept, those principles that allow any and all engineers to build amazing data-driven apps. If I think back to how it was for me when I was building apps, it is just so much better to build with great DX. You can focus on the things that you want to focus on. And for me, Data DX is that concept of putting a name to that and allowing other companies and allowing engineers to all have that shared understanding of what that means to build great data-driven apps and what that experience is to have a good experience when building these apps.
You alluded to this already, but how do you think about the difference between developer experience in general and then Data DX as a separate category?
I think specifically Data DX for me is sort of that subset of DX where it's really about how you build with data. For me, specifically, personally, that means that I don't need to know much about databases and still be able to build applications that use databases. I don't need to know about indexes. I don't need to know about how to scale database clusters. I don't need to know about any of those things, and I can still build the data-driven app that still has all those features, all those characteristics, all those things that I want to provide to my users. I can still get that done with great Data DX, even without knowing about all of those. What about yourself? How do you think about great Data DX and what does it mean to you?
I think that's a key point. If I go back to when I started as a professional software engineer 15 years ago, I was on the application development team and we were trying to deliver a great experience to our end users. And we found that we were constantly drawn back to thinking about the database because it never really worked. We had to keep scaling it, thinking about different ways to query data. We spent a lot of time building a bespoke system that could migrate data from our relational database to a document database so we could query it faster. And we didn't want to deal with any of that, right? We just had to. So we ended up splitting ourselves into two groups, an application development group and a infrastructure team that built what you could call an application development platform internally to our company. And that way we could spend a lot of time over here to make the other group productive. Mm. And I think what we're seeing now is that that's such a common pattern that there's an entire industry now of companies turning that into product. So instead of every single organization having to figure this out and build their internal platform, they can go out to some of these companies and they can buy the part of that platform that they need. And that increasing the abstraction level, so you don't have to worry about that. You can just build your application and the data part just works. That's what Data DX is to me.
And I think that's amazing because you can take advantage of all these experts who are great at what they do. You don't need to have that knowledge in-house. You don't need to have that other team who are complete experts in how to scale databases or how to do any of these things. You can just focus on the things that your company does well. And I think that's something that really unlocks something new for these companies, for these teams, because you don't need those experts. You don't need that expert team. You have this whole company that you can just, in usually a few lines of code, you can just take advantage of all that expertise. And I think that's amazing. How do you think about the different companies and different tools that work together on a similar concept of data DX and data developer experience and working together to create a more cohesive experience when using these various tools together.
So that's really why we wanted to establish this category, data DX, because we saw that a lot of companies were having the same realization as us, working from different directions. And we wanted to make sure we all have a name that we can kind of band around together and therefore be more effective. So what we're doing now, we're inviting companies to come participate in this conversation and talk about data DX and figure out together what does this mean for us as an industry.
It's so great to see that these principles of data DX are shared among all these companies. It really means to me that there is something foundational that we all agree on that we can enable these application developers to build with. And it's really great to see these different aspects and perspectives from all of these companies and how these tools build together.
Absolutely.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Petra. I'm the head of developer connections here at Prisma, and I'll be moderating this panel about database tools and how to work with databases and the developer experience around that.
Thanks, Petra. I am Søren Baumer, the founder of Prisma. We have been on this mission for 8 years now to simplify how developers work with databases and data in general. And I'm really excited to talk to all of you about the journey you have been on and how it all interconnects in this world of data DX that we're here to talk about today.
Hey, I'm Tudor. I'm a CTO at Xata. We are a Postgres data platform. This is how we call ourselves. Basically, it's a Postgres service, and we add a bunch of add-ons on top, mostly focused on developer experience. So I'm looking forward to this. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Hi, my name is Deepti Sigreddy. I'm an engineer at PlanetScale, where we focus on developer experience for databases, specifically MySQL compatible database. And I am an early engineer at PlanetScale, and I've been there from the beginning. So I've seen this developer experience evolve over the last 5 years, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's perspective on it.
Hey everyone, my name is Peter. I'm the CEO and founder of Snaplet, where our mission is to give developers access to production-like data. And before that, I was the co-creator of a JavaScript framework called Redwood.js.
I am Glauber Costa, and I am the founder of Turso. There are many ways to explain what Turso is. I think today, for the purpose of this discussion, I will go with a user-contributed description of Turso, the crazy folks who fork SQLite. This is us, and before that, I had around 10 years of experience in the Linux kernel, and later at a petabyte scale NoSQL database called Scylla, where I was an early engineer. So I've been around systems design, systems programming, and databases for a long time as well.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. It's going to be so great to hear how you all think about developer experience. I think all of us understand so much about how people work with databases and how we have been working on making that experience better and great, and how we can contribute to users using databases more easily. And I think, Glauber, you mentioned Turso logo and name, and I think that's how some engineers like I did in the past feel about databases, where a little bit of help in terms of database developer experience always helps, because it's sort of this monster maybe in the background where we're not really sure how to use databases. And it's so amazing to have all of these tools that really help us work with databases in an amazing way that was not available 10, 20 years ago.
A lot of the things that we see in the industry, and this is true in general, not only of databases, is accidental complexity. You're coming up with these great ideas to fix problems that you wouldn't have had to begin with if things start in a different direction. And I'm not going to claim that all of the issues that we have with databases are just accidental complexity. Some of them are real complexity. But in a sense, SQLite is this going back to the basics and let's forget everything. Let's keep it simple, right? And if we keep things extremely simple, right? What can we do with that? Can the developer experience be 10 times better? Can we do things like you just develop locally without connecting to anything? So we've been doing this for a long time. We've been playing around with that idea for a long time. So we like to think of ourselves. I mean, the logo is not supposed to be scary. It's not supposed to be like the bad monster. It's supposed to be the good monster. And we're trying to make it friendlier. We'll have updates to that.
So there's accidental complexity and there's necessary complexity. And sometimes what you are aiming for with developer experience is how you hide that complexity from the developers. And that's why you need a platform or multiple platforms represented here, because to provide certain properties of the system, scalability, availability, what have you, sometimes you do need complexity.
Absolutely. Yeah, but then again, like personally, I feel that the things that are necessary complexity, and I like the way you put it, the things that are necessary complexity are exactly the things that you can solve with like layers and platforms and etc. Because now I am allowing you to do something that is complex by nature, and I'm trying to make it easier. The problem sometimes happens when this is masking accidental complexity, right? Because then you would have a much simpler solution by just removing a lot of layers, and instead of having to present you with a new platform concept. And for what it's worth, I think your company in particular is a company that does this very well. Right, so I'm not saying that, but there is a distinction that I think goes beyond databases, but in particular in databases, any complex systems, what is accidental complexity and what is necessary complexity.
I think what's important also is to phrase like the point in time when you're trying to reduce complexity. One of the things that we focused on when we were building Redwood.js was we split the development experience into different parts. We had design time. I'm busy building software. When I'm busy building software, what are things that suck? And then there's build time. I'm getting ready to ship to a server. What are the things that are terrible? And then there's like production time, runtime. There are things there that are also terrible. But there are different people that are responsible for those different segments of your life cycle of application software development. So it's like in each one of those segments, there's innovation that can happen towards developer experience.
So what I would add on the topic of complexity in the database, and I think it's interesting. I think all of us here are building on existing open source projects that are pretty long, right? Like PlanetScale on MySQL, and then Turso on SQLite, and we do on Postgres. And I think the reason for that is none of us really wanted to start a database from scratch, because then what you happen, you're basically just rediscovering all the errors that others have solved in the past. So that that accidental complexity is maybe the cost of getting to a system that's really successful and that has like a lot of applications built on top of them, a lot of developers really liking those systems and such. And then like we're trying to we like the way to reduce this complexity is of course to mask some things, but at the same time you have to be careful not to mask the things that people like, and not everyone is going to like the same things, right? So I think it's quite an interesting balance on what you mask, what escape hatches you have. It's like maybe it's not in the default developer experience, but if you need some some crazy join and with some extension and so on, that should still be possible, right?
I built at least one database from scratch, and it's not fun. In fact, when I told, well, it's fun, but at the same time, it's completely just I wouldn't do it again. 1 out of 10, don't recommend. I mean, it's just it's great, but it's not. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and especially in the SQL world. I mean, I think there's an opportunity. I don't think there's anybody represented here that is not doing any things around SQL, as far as I understand. But in the NoSQL world, I think there is some opportunity still to do things from scratch, because you can pick a domain, you can pick a niche, and you can say, hey, I'm going to solve this small problem here. But the surface area for SQL, after decades, how many decades we've been doing this for, it's just so much built that for you to catch up, I mean, and start from scratch is just doesn't sound like the smartest idea in the planet.
Exactly. Like a key value store, the API surface area is pretty small, so you can do that. but SQL, there's all the features that have been added over time, and they were added because someone needed them, right? So it's going to be really hard to do it from scratch. But there are definitely people that are still doing that. So I don't want to, like I look forward to new database systems showing up.
I think it's not just the features, right? Just that there is the history of how people use the features. Right? You put a new feature out, and I think this is one of the things that we, as people building on the open source, correct me if you disagree, by the way, please, but it's not only that we don't have to code a feature, is that we know exactly how people use that feature and we know what matters. And to your point that we don't want to mask the right thing. Like when we were working, for example, in my previous company, there were many things that we put out that were very innovative, again, in the NoSQL world. But you spend 6 months, 9 months, however much time developing database things in the database world tend to take a long time to develop. So there's that as well. You put it out and you don't necessarily know how people are going to use it. So you have all those assumptions, and let's not even focus on the performance stuff, only on the developer experience. You have all these assumptions about how the workflow will be once somebody touches that. And then you give it to them, they use it in a completely different way, or they imagine this in a completely different way. And by building on open source, by building on established technologies, it's not just the features that you inherit, you also inherit all the history of how people use this. So you can do a much better job in focusing on, oh, I know that those are the problems that people have with this particular feature set. So let's focus on that. You don't have to imagine.
That's a great point. I think that approach is actually what is driving the current focus on developer experience, because people have been using SQL and NoSQL databases for SQL for 40 plus years, NoSQL for 20 plus years. So the pain points have become obvious, and that has created the opening and the opportunity for people like the group here to come in and say, these are the problems we are going to solve. We are not going to rebuild hash join, by the way. We are going to make XYZ, schema changes, deployments, the things that are actually hurting developers. We are going to make those better.
One interesting tension I would like to dig into a little bit with you is hiding complexity on one side, and then on the other side, really wanting to enable developers to get access to all the underlying functionality. And I think there's an interesting contrast between PlanetScale, which is just MySQL with a bunch of stuff, but you interface it as MySQL. And then Xata on the other side that couples together multiple databases and does some data synchronization under the hood, which gives you a lot of benefit, but it also becomes less standard, more of a black box that developers need to understand. Maybe Tudor, you could start by unpacking that a little bit, the benefit versus the con of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give people a little bit of context, so the way Xata works is that we store the data in Postgres, and that's the source of truth. But we also automatically replicate it to Elasticsearch, from where we offer especially search functionality, including things like vector search, hybrid search, this kind of stuff, and also aggregation support, because like Elastic can be used more as an OLAP type of databases. And so far, and actually that's changing a little bit. We have learned our lessons a bit. So far, we have proposed our own API, so we didn't offer direct SQL access. Like direct access to Postgres, we weren't offering. We were offering our own API, and that made things really easy for people to get started. And this was our initial focus. Like we said, let's make a database that's powerful, but as easy to use as almost like a local database. And we took actually quite a lot of inspiration from Airtable in their data model and in how they present things in the UI and so on. We really wanted to make something that's super easy to use.
Would you say that that actually makes the developer experience when working with databases more complex to create a good developer experience, because you have to cater for both these escape hatches and making sure that you can enable everything that these underlying databases can do, while you also want to make sure that it's easy to use and that you cater for the use cases also where you can simplify and you can provide a much better developer experience than what the underlying technology would. So you have to sort of balance this and make sure that you really can cater for both worlds, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, I think that tension is definitely there, even at planet scale, where the interface is SQL. The interface is not SQL for everything because the parts that MySQL didn't do well, like schema changes, we said you will do them differently. So that's a totally different experience versus just opening up a MySQL client and executing ad hoc queries. So those two things do need to coexist, and they also need to feel somewhat seamless.
Yeah, that's another really good example that also we hit at Xata. So we have this system to do schema changes with zero downtime, and you can roll back and you can have the application talk like the old and the new version talk to your database and feel like there was no upgrade and so on. uh, but then the issue is people are using Prisma migrations or Django migrations, or like almost every framework or any programming language has the kind of their preferred way of doing schema changes, and then you have to be compatible with how people are doing things. Otherwise, like too few people are going to adopt that feature and get the benefit of it.
The strength of the ecosystem is a core component of data DX, and it's a really important thing that developers look at and evaluate when they pick new tooling. So when you start a new database company like Xata, and you need to figure out what existing ecosystem can you sit in. And if you are not sitting in an existing ecosystem, you need to make damn sure that this new ecosystem you're building is actually worth it, such that people will pick it. And for you, Dipti, at Planet you're clearly positioned inside the MySQL ecosystem. But then you step outside a little bit and you say, migrations, actually, we think we can do this better. Do you find that you are far enough into the MySQL ecosystem that you benefit from the strength of that community, or is that a sticking point for new users when they come to you?
I don't think it's really a sticking point for new users, but definitely new users have a lot more options to choose from versus people who are already in MySQL and comfortable with MySQL, right? Let's be honest, there's SQLite, there's Postgres, there are many options. Like Glauber said earlier, many of the core problems, the optimization of queries, the query execution, those things MySQL does well enough that we don't have to worry about them. And that actually frees us up to worry about the developer experience.
What do you think some of the core challenges are that you are solving with Planet Scale so that you can give a better developer experience when working with that underlying database? What do you think the biggest solutions to make that developer experience better?
So, to some extent, this goes back to what Peter was saying, where you segment the developer experience into the development time versus deployment time versus production time. So, schema changes are actually problematic both at development time and deployment or production time, because historically, deploying large schema changes to MySQL has resulted in the database locking up, not taking queries, and so on and so forth, right? And for developers, and I was in this position, not with MySQL, but with Oracle 20 years ago, where if you want to make a schema change, you have to go through a DBA. You have to
I'm
write
sorry
out
to
a
hear
change
that.
request and so on and so forth, right? There are certain things which span that spectrum of development, deployment, and production. And there are certain things that are specific to one part of them. And availability and scalability are actually specific to when you go into production, because you're not so worried about them at development time. Database went down, I'll just restart it. It's a toy database, right? And those are things that we are able to do very well because of the open source technology that we are using, Vitess, which has already solved that problem of how do you keep a distributed system available and how do you scale it. So the solutions to each of the problems are sometimes the same and sometimes different depending on which part of this develop, deploy, production flow you are trying to solve it for.
We talk about this idea of a different set of experiences needed when you are applying data changes in production versus deploying data changes in development. And I think, to my mind, PlanetScale is the gold standard for how you deploy data schema changes in production. And I think at Snaplet, you are aspiring to build the gold standard for how to change the data schema in development. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that developers really need access to when they're making schema migrations is the data itself. They need to be able to test their schema migrations against the data set that they expected to run against in production. And if you can't branch your database, or if you just don't have access to something that looks like the actual data in production, you're kind of doing it blindly, and you're going to hit problems that you just couldn't have expected. And one of the things that I find quite surprising is that you would expect the schema to be the source of truth for how the data is represented in the database. In other words, like some of the things that I've seen is like it's a not nullable column, and you'll get a situation with Postgres in some databases that we've worked in where it is null, and it's impossible to understand how that happened. It's a database; it isn't infallible. But if you don't have access to that data, what do you do? And I think that's one of the things that's really important for developers, is just to have visibility, because otherwise they're operating under assumptions, and those assumptions are always going to lead to bugs, and they're going to lead to bugs in production. So that's what Snaplet is doing, or trying to do, is give developers access to data without privacy concerns or like scalability concerns and things like that in Postgres.
I also really like how all of these tools work well together to create an even better developer experience. So if you use Prisma together with Snaplet and you use it with PlanetScale, you get all the benefits of all of these things, and we all bring our opinions and expertise to make that developer experience better from a specific angle. And then it's amazing to see how these data DX tools can work well together to create something even better as a whole.
Yeah, I come from a position of a product developer, so that's my lens. I'm trying to improve the experience for people like me. And one of the things that I've always struggled with is having to go to someone in a different part of my organization and get access to things from them, when I just want to, fix bugs and build features and ship. That's it. I don't want to have to deal with the complexity of getting access to data.
When I started 20 something years ago, doing this crazy, at the time, like a unproven thing that I was criticized for doing, called open source. Today is it's what everybody does. But like when I started contributing to the Linux kernel and orienting my career towards open source, one of the things that resonated with me was exactly this idea that with open source, you don't ask for permission. You don't have to ask anybody for permission to do anything, like anything. I, as a college student, I started contributing to, at the time, one of the most complex projects out there, both socially and technically. I never had to ask anybody for permission, right? I just did it. And I find it very interesting that what is open source is a different question, especially now, like we see with AI, open models, but those principles of open source, right? They stuck with us one way or another, and they come back in situations like that. Part of this created a great developer experience for developers back then. Like, I want open source. I don't want to go through Oracle. I don't want to go through Microsoft. I don't want to do any of that because I don't want to ask for permission. This creates a human problem, right? And in a sense, a good developer experience today in databases have to inherit the same property. Right? Just don't ask for permission. Just have things that allow you to just do what you need to do.
It's like this rebel hacker mentality, right?
Exactly.
Like going against the grain a little bit. And
maybe it's because we're all introverts. So every time you have to talk to someone, you'll just say,
We're just like, nah. When you forked the SQLite, that was quite a controversial move, right? Like, there was a lot of pushback when you did that, when you launched this blog post on Hacker News.
Absolutely.
I felt for you, but you handled it really well.
Thank you.
So when you think about that fork, what are some of the DX improvements that enabled you guys to make happen?
Schema changes. That's why I was asking Gypty that question, because like schema changes in SQLite are extremely painful, but they're painful in a way that they're different than MySQL. Like they're painful because they're restrictive. It's not about taking the database down or anything like that. The way people use SQLite is very different. So one of the things that for example, if you go to our pricing page, you're going to see that in our $29 a month plan, we offer people 10,000 databases, which is like a mind-blowing number. But that's because the way people use SQLite traditionally is like those very small per user databases, etc. So it's not. I don't think we'll ever see like a petabyte database on SQLite. PlanetScale may have a couple of petabyte databases, or at least many terabytes. So they're painful in a different way than MySQL. They're painful because there is a lot of stuff that you just can't do.
Glavo, you mentioned a thing here that I would like to dive into a little bit. You said 10,000 databases on the cheap plan. That's really cool. And one of the things I've been looking for the last 10 years is I want databases to be more like pages in Notion. I didn't know it was called Notion back then, but now I know. I want databases to be like pages in Notion. They should be easy to create, virtually free, and then you shouldn't have to worry about them. They should just work. I never have to babysit a Notion page. I leave it there, I come back, it still works. And I think there's maybe a tension between those two things, because the page just working always, PlanetScale does that really, really well. I create a database at PlanetScale, it just works. No matter the amount of traffic, it keeps working. But then there's the other side of it that I want. I want to be able to create thousands of these, millions. And if I go to PlanetScale and try to do that, it gets really costly. So is there a tension? Is there some future development for the product to happen? Maybe you start with you, Dipti, and then Glavo, you could talk a bit about your 10,000 databases.
That's a pretty difficult question for us to answer right now. I think what a future could look like is that that people end up using something like Terso in development, where they can get 10,000 and then they find a path to deploying that database into production if they need to. So there are many people who want to try something out, use a database for a few days, and then they're done. They just throw it away. They never come back to it, right? But there is the minority of people who eventually want to take that database into production. So maybe there is a way where you do that with SQLite and eventually migrate to MySQL. So
Of course.
that's the
but like the way we think about this multiple databases is some people definitely use it like that, and there are some people. We offer 500 for free, by the way, just so there are some users that are just using this for like different projects. Creating a database is so cheap. I will architecture things in a way where I create a lot of them. Like if you were doing this on PlanetScale, you would potentially create a big database and give every user their own tables. But then you also have a limit on tables, and then you might create a table with a lot of users. But for us, you go and create a database. But I will be lying, Soren, if I say like this. Yeah, you're never going to have any problems with that. This is why the NoSQL movement exists, because people realize that SQL is great, but there are limits here. So after you're out of those limits, you have to go do something else, and you have to re-architecture your things, right? So part of the reason PlanetScale scales very well is I understand, and Deeply will keep me honest and correct me if I'm wrong. It's not because of MySQL; it's because of Vitess. Right? Vitess is a scale-out architecture, right? It's a naturally sharding architecture that inherits a lot of things from the NoSQL world. It allows horizontal scalability and allows you to, but it comes with its own set of problems as well, because now you need to make sure that you're hitting the right node or anything like that. So there is always going to be this trade-off here. This choice will always have to be yours. If you ever expect you want to have multiple databases and use it like Notion, if you ever expect one particular database for one user to have 10 billion requests per second and grow to 2 terabytes, it probably doesn't fit the model, right? So you have to do something else. Either you say, now let me try to find a way to move all of those 10,000 databases to table representations on PlanetScale, or you're going to say, look, that's fine for this one user, that one database, and one user that justifies the cost. I'm going to have to, because it's a business interest of mine, I'm going to have to deal with a different schema, with a different language, and take it away and use a hybrid system. But everything has its limits, right? And we scale decently well. Like SQLite scales very well for reads, especially with the replication that we present. But it's not going to scale that well for writes. It's not going to scale that well in the amount of data that you can handle. Like you're never going to store more data than you can fit in a box, unlike something like Vitesse. So there are always things that are architecturally set for you, and you as a user have to make the choice.
Yeah, I think another issue with this tenant per database approach is you have to be pretty sure that you don't need queries cross tenants, right? Because then you're going to have to do them in your application or something like this. So there's definitely tensions, I think, between this, and then to some degree, this idea of having like a database, like a Notion page, is the whole reason Zeta exists. Kind of, we were just using Airtable as an example rather than Notion. It was more popular back then, but like that was our reason, and the way we did it was by using different schemas in Postgres, essentially namespaces. So you can put many tenants if you want, or many development branches, or what have you, on the same Postgres cluster, right? But then what you hit on the other side is the noisy neighbor type of issues, where when one user can create a load that impacts the others. So then what we did was to have the ability to abstract a little bit and have multiple database in one instance, and other databases in another instance. So the impact zone of an issue is more localized, right? So we're doing a little bit of an abstraction between the database endpoint that you're hitting and where it is stored on which of the Postgres clusters and such, right? But yeah, that's definitely one of these tension points that's just hard to solve.
A lot of people who use Prisma, I think the value is that they have optionality. They can start in one place and they can use something like a SQLite, and then they know that with very little effort they can migrate to a different platform like PlanetScale, AtScale. So, Glauber, when you talk to people who come and look at Terso and might be nervous about buying into this new ecosystem, is that a conversation you had with them? The fact that it is just SQL, you could use something like Prisma, and then if they get stuck for whatever reason, they can always move on to something else.
It has to do with this optionality, like that I want to, like, as a principle. It's one of the principles of open source that stuck with us. I don't want to be constrained by anything. I don't want to be changed to anything. So I want to be always have the optionality of moving out for whatever reason. And then you ask them the reason. They said, I don't know. I don't care. Like, I will have my reasons in the future. This is a future me question. It's not a present me question. Again, lots of people who come to us, especially because of the ecosystems that we target in JavaScript and etc., already come with their ORM of choice. And right, so it's not that we have a lot of choice in that matter. They come and say, hey, we're using Prisma. How can I use Prisma with Terso? So I don't think this is a question that we hear a lot specifically, but we do hear questions about, can I download my SQLite file? Right? Can I export the data? So the optionality is there. And I am sure it's on people's mind. So I mean, I think they don't ask us that because it's an obvious question for them, but I'm sure it's on their mind. I mean, I would not want to write raw SQL. I want to use something like Prisma because I want to have this optionality. So again, I think optionality is something that everybody wants. They want it because future me may think differently than present me for whatever reason. Right? So just I want to know that I can get out of that.
We do get this, not so much in terms of being able to take the data and migrate to some other type of database, but just in terms of, if I want to leave, can I leave? And that's one of the guarantees we've tried to provide at PlanetScale from the very beginning. We are not going to hold your data hostage. If you want to leave, you get to take your data with you.
Yeah, I think even more important than the storage format is the protocol, because that's what people depend on in their applications, right? And that's why that's I guess one of the main reasons for which we pick Postgres, that it has this very open protocol with like you can implement it in multiple languages, and you can use the source code in different languages and such. You can basically do more behind the same protocol, and by being super open about the wire protocol, Postgres also like wins more mindshare, right? Because then you have alternative implementations like CockroachDB and Yugabyte and so on, and so that you can do more interesting stuff. So yeah, we could standardize on SQLite as the storage layer and Postgres wire protocol. That would be great.
I've seen customers migrate, again, take 3 months to move their data from one place to the other with a Spark cluster, reading from one and writing to the other, and dual writes. People were willing to do this, right? Not everybody, and it is a barrier, and right, just it's not trivial, but people were willing to do this, but they were not willing to change their code, right? So I guess I'll never understand it because I'm a programmer. I love changing the code. That's what I do. I do it for fun. But people in business settings were able to go through extreme pains to migrate the data, but they would rather not touch the code. And that is exactly, I think, the role that a tool like Prisma can play, because ultimately you don't change your code. If you want to go from one thing to the other, if you want to have this optionality, which everybody, my claim is that everybody wants, you don't have to change your code.
It's a really astute point, and what Prisma brings to the table is really a more constrained API to your data that works the same no matter what database you're working against. That constrained API is also limiting, right? It means there are certain things you can't do. But then we have escape hatches. So you can still do raw SQL queries, and you should go and do those. But now you have them marked, they're over here, you have 7 of them. All your normal stuff is through this constrained API, and that you can move between databases as you want to. It gives you a lot of optionality as a developer, picking what database you're using. But it also gives us an opportunity to introduce tooling in between, because now we have that central point where everything is going through. It's a more constrained problem than general SQL. So we can do more interesting things, and that's where we are heading as a company now. And I would like to use this to get to you, Dipti, and ask, where's PlanetScale going? Because you have this amazing RDS replacement, like a MySQL database that just works. And you also have Vitesse, which is this centralized platform that enables you to do all kinds of interesting things. So are you going to broaden out and have more of a data platform, or will you stay narrow and be the scalable MySQL database?
I think the focus in the short term has to be on getting more and more large databases migrated into PlanetScale, because really that's one of our strengths. And developer experience is a part of the package, but you will realize the full benefits and the full potential of PlanetScale on large sharded databases, right? And those are the people for whom there are very few options. In the longer term, we have to see where we end up in terms of what feedback we get from users. Right now, we are still sort of leading with features. For instance, query insights. That is very popular and very useful. Where do we take that next? Or what is the next query insights? These are some things that we have to figure out. So I don't have a great answer in terms of whether we will turn it into a data platform. Maybe, maybe not.
Thank you. I have so many ideas for where you could go, but obviously, you know where you're going.
Well, I was just thinking, I have an idea for where you could go. Make those migrations happen. People want to migrate their data from SQLite to MySQL, do it through Prisma.
So broadening out from there, what do you think are the next DX challenges that would make developers' lives easier? What do you think that you all can help developers with to make their lives easier, just like we have done and you have done over the last 5, 10 X years? What are the next great things to improve?
There's lots that we can discuss. I think schema changes was discussed here quite a bit, and there's a good reason for that. In general, I'm kind of just happy that this wave of databases that exist focus a little bit less on the raw performance and scalability, and focus a little bit more on the developer experience and operational aspects of it. And schema change is one of them. But then I think there's still a lot of improvements that we can do, especially in the Postgres land, so to say, with what I call more like janitorial issues. Like people have issues with vacuum or transaction ID overlap and so on, and getting visibility in that. Oftentimes it takes them by surprise and so on. And these are things that we just can do better, I think, and that will get us also a step closer to this idea of a database like a Notion page, essentially.
I like that.
Yeah, yeah. So this schema changes the serverless aspect so that it kind of just works and you don't have to worry about. And then it's also like things like scalability, like going beyond the threshold, that happening automatically, so it's cost effective, right? So auto scaling based on your traffic, so you only pay based on like how much you actually consume. Now you don't have to set like a very you don't have to over provision your databases and such, this kind of things.
Tudor, the thing that I think you are quite advanced in, and I would like, that's why I asked you before, Dipti, about this data platform. What else could you do? Tudor, you couple different databases together, Postgres and Elasticsearch, and it happens seamlessly to the end user. So I think now we're getting to a point where individual databases, they work really well, but it's still a mess to be working with multiple databases. What is your single source of truth? How does data flow? All of that is kind of left up to the developer, to the application developer, who doesn't know how to build these systems. And I think Xata has taken a first step at defining how should that work.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
I'm very surprised that Kafka is not in your picture, Tudor. It was in ours to some extent, because if you go talk to enterprises,
we do have
there's always a lot of Kafka. There's always a lot of Kafka.
I think I only let it out of the diagram because I didn't want to complicate it too much. But we do use Kafka internally, and we do base a lot on this idea of change data capture. So like we get a stream of events from Postgres, and that you can use for a number of things, for cache invalidation, for example. Like you can cache the data on the edge or a centralized cache, but then you can automatically invalidate it, things like this. We replicated the data in Elasticsearch, and we do want to open it up a little bit more to do like webhooks. So you can now like call webhooks and this type of things. I think Prisma is working on in that space as well, right? With Prisma Pulse, that's pretty similar stuff. Yes.
You actually made a really good point by bringing this up, because so far the focus of developer experience has been on the application developer, but we have a growing cadre of data developers, data engineers who need similar improvements in their developer experience.
That's really interesting. And they need to tie that data to the operational data, right? They don't need to just work on the data warehouse that gets a dump once a day or something. They need access to the real data that is powering the applications.
For me, everything always starts with visibility, right? It's just I would love to have, and again, Prisma is in a great position to deliver something like that, but a cross database, cross ecosystem ways to visualize what you're doing, understand what you're doing. And I think it ties to some extent with what Deepti just mentioned, not just operational developers, but like data people. They need to understand, like, what is my data? What is in here? What are the patterns that are here? And then the operational aspect is like, what are the query patterns? What is happening? What is what's going on? And there is a lot of this what is going on that happens in lower layers. But I think one thing that I would expect to see, and I would love, maybe I'm wishful thinking here, but I would love to see, is this moving up to more upper standardized layers in which I can have to say, oh, now I'm using Prisma. Now I have visibility and observability over everything I do, regardless of how I do. So one can dream.
Yeah.
I, I guess also it's almost obligatory at this point to talk about AI and ML. And
Oh yeah.
if we look at how people had to build their machine learning systems, to start with, everybody basically said, okay, I have all this data. I'm going to store it in files and I'm going to write some code to process the files, store the embeddings or features in some general purpose database, and you have all this custom stuff around it, right? But we are seeing that there are databases which are coming up which specialize in these use cases where they hide this complexity from the machine learning researcher so that they don't have to write all this code, and they can configure these databases and say, here is my data, load it. It will load it somewhere, and then they are able to run their models on that data, and these specialized databases are taking care of keeping everything in sync, up to date, whatever you want to call it, and providing that sort of a developer experience in this specialized field.
In the beginning of the year, we saw an absurd amount of money being invested into vector database companies. The stuff you talked about, Dipti, is that vector databases? Are any of you building vector databases, or are we talking about something else that is even above or beyond?
I think there are two categories. One is there are specialized vector databases that people are building, but also most general purpose databases have either announced vector support already, or they're working on it and they say it's coming, and that includes MySQL.
I think this is probably also a good spot to take a wrap. We have went from Oracle in the past issues with databases, from migrations all the way to vector databases and AI. We've covered a lot of ground in terms of how developer experience has been, is, and will be when working with all of these database tools. And I think it's been amazing to hear from all of you with the different aspects and the different opinions and how it all really comes together in one picture of wanting to make developer experience better, because that's I think the bottom line of and the essential of building amazing applications in the future.
Hey everyone, this is Tudor from Xata, and I want to talk to you about a feature that we have recently launched and that I think illustrates really nicely this idea of data DX, or data developer experience, and shows how easy it is to work with files in your application if you could attach files to your database records. For the demo, let's say I'm building some sort of butterfly app. So it's a website or app for the butterfly enthusiasts to collaborate on documenting the different species and whatnot. And we have a column title, description, and tags, which are all really important. But also important to me is the ability for users to upload files and control their permissions and such. For this, I'm going to add a new column. It's a column of type file. And I'm going to select allowing multiple files to be uploaded to the same database cell and make them private by default. This is a rich type in Xata, and it's quite special. You see what's going on behind the scenes. And once the column is created, then what I can do is it's simply drag and drop files to it. So, I can drag and drop a couple of monarch butterflies here and clouded yellow butterfly here, for example. And we also support uploading videos or GIFs. So I can put that, and really any type of files. So I can show that with a zip file here. And if you open them, you see the options here. You can download and delete, of course. You can also make them public. And this means that the file can be accessed by anyone that has the URL. So I'm actually going to switch it back to private, which means that I can only access these files if I have access to this database row, right? So that they are tied together. Also, if I delete this record, then the files are automatically deleted. We take care of that for you. The way that works, let's talk a little bit about that. and think about how would you do it if you were to implement this yourself, you'd probably choose to store the images for cost reasons and such in a storage system like S3, and then have a record in the database that stores the URL to that. And that's actually what Xata does behind the scenes as well. It just abstracts that behind the Xata API. That makes that really easy. Now, if you do that and just store the public URL in the database, you get that via the app to the browser, and the browser can request it. That's fine, but it's not the most secure option because anyone with the public URL can access the image. So in Xata, we have multiple options. There's the public URL, but also authenticated URLs, which means that you get the exact same way you access database records, you access files as well, and you are authenticated with the Xata API key. This is more secure, but could be not very convenient. And then you have also the option of signed URLs, which means that you get through the Xata API a signed URL, and then the browser can again request the image from S3 directly. But the access is controlled by the Xata API, which will verify that the signed URL, which also expires after a time, is correct. Speaking of the Xata API, it also comes with more stuff. It does CDN caching, which means your images are served globally, and it's always fast and saves also on bandwidth costs. And it also supports image transformation. So things like requesting a particular size, thumbnail size, and so on, rotating them, changing the background, what have you, is just supported built-in by Xata. And this all might sound quite complicated, but actually the Xata APIs and SDK makes that really easy. So here is an example on how to create a record and then I'll upload an image to it. It's really just 2 lines of code. If you want to see a more complete example application, there is xatagallery.vercel.app, and the source code for each is all on GitHub. The sample apps allows you to navigate by tags, for example, and it has a search functionality. So if I search here for red, I can bring up a picture, and you see how the background changes the color that's using these transforms that we support built in. What else can you build with this? Actually, all sorts of things. You can build social network type of sites, job boards, classified ads, anything where it's important for the users to have the ability to upload files and then to control the visibility and who's able to edit those files. Then it's very convenient to use this system. If you want to try it out, just simply go to xata.io and click Start Free, and you'll be all set. Thank you.
My name is Petra. I'm head of developer connections here at Prisma, and I'm super excited to hear from all of you about building data-driven applications.
Thank you, Petra. So my name is Søren, and I'm the founder of Prisma. We've been on this mission for 8 years now to make it easier for developers to build applications with data. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. And as you go and introduce yourself, take a bit of time to talk also about the company you're at, what you're doing, why that's exciting.
My name is Amy Dutton. I am a lead maintainer on the Redwood JS core team, and I am really enjoying working at Redwood, just being able to contribute to open source, and we are using Prisma under the hood. So it's exciting to see those things collide.
Hey, Frederick, founder of GraphBase here. I've been using GraphQL since it almost came out in 2015 and decided to start a company focused on the DX of building and deploying GraphQL APIs. Been doing this for about 2+ years now, and yeah, excited to talk about DX in general, but also, of course, the focus on data.
So I'm Al. I'm head of DevRel at Tinybird. So I've been in the data engineering and architecture space for the past 10 years with a focus on big data, real-time analytics, cybersecurity. So hopefully a bit of a contrasting background with some folks that are looking more at the transactional side. I come from more of an analytics background, but I'm at Tinybird now, and Tinybird is a real-time analytics platform. So it's focusing on the user-facing and application side of analytics.
That's super cool. Before we dive in, I would like to just ask a question right away. Amy, does Redwood have something to do with GraphQL? Does Redwood make it easy to expose a GraphQL API?
I think it does. People complain all the time about GraphQL with their N+1 problems and just trying to, I don't know, whenever I've worked with stuff, it's frustrating because you have to, write a query and a mutation and a resolver and then describe your types and do all these things. And it feels so repetitive and mundane and boring as a developer having to rewrite those things over and over again. And so with Redwood, you can write your schema.prisma file, create your model, and then run a migration, and then it will generate those queries and mutations and resolvers for you. Of course, you can modify those, you can expand on them, but it gives you a great starting point so you don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. And then with the N+1 problem, we also have Redwood Studio, which will help you find a lot of those performance issues that you might be running into.
So Redwood can actually auto generate all of the code or scaffold the code that you need to create an API based on your database schema. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it makes it so much easier to work with. And we have tooling also incorporated with Redwood Studio that pulls in like the GraphQL playground. So a lot of times my workflow looks like I create the schema, I generate the code, and then I will play within the playground to generate those queries and mutations, and then just copy and paste that code into a cell. And with Redwood, a cell is something very Redwood-y. It kind of makes Redwood. But what that does is when you're working with React and you're dealing with data, you have to keep track of the state that you're dealing with data. You have to keep track of the loading state, the success state, the failure state, an empty state, and a success state. And so what a cell does is it determines what state you're in. So you don't have to run all those conditionals yourself, especially if you're trying to pull in multiple pieces of data, you're having to do that multiple times. A cell does all of that for you, and then will deliver the correct React component based on that state. And so then you're just dumping your queries in and it's delivering that content as you would want it to be. So I found that I can move a lot faster whenever I'm developing because of those tools that Redwood provides, but also because Prisma is running underneath the hood on all that.
Thank you. And then Frederick, just to kind of get us started, maybe you can contrast that to what GraphBase does, because GraphBase also makes it delightfully easy to work with or build a GraphQL API, but it is, I think, very different from Redwood. Maybe you can help us understand.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I mean, Redwood and Prisma is very impressive, but GraphBase, we are only focused on GraphQL, so we have the luxury of just doing one thing and hopefully doing it really well. But we've kind of taken the approach of creating something we call connectors, which is essentially an abstraction over data stores, APIs, and microservices, where you can say, I might have a few hundred microservices that speak REST using OpenAPI. Then you can easily kind of introspect and generate queries, mutations from that. And then you can also customize it, right? So you can transform, shape as you please, or create custom resolvers if you want to kind of add fields or add custom logic that's not kind of generated for you. So we have a few, like we have Postgres, obviously, and then Mongo, GraphQL, OpenAPI, and then we have a bunch of interesting connectors in the works, but it's a tough prioritization problem. I'm sure Prisma has dealt with for many years. The big thing for us is like we started at the edge, of course. So we've had to deal with a lot of extra problems too, right? So every GraphQL API you deploy with GraphBase, it has a similar DX to Netlify, Vercel, where you start locally and then you can push to production using either the CLI or GitHub, and it will create branches for you. And then it's also deployed to the edge, right? So we sit on top of Cloudflare workers, and every gateway or API is essentially living right next to the user, which sounds great, and it is, but it's a lot of work to get it to compile and be performant, because all the drivers and libraries are not typically meant for that. So
that's really interesting. I think the entire software industry is going through this transition where we used to deploy everything in one place. Maybe it was on-premise, and then we got the regions from AWS, and some of us tried to manage multiple regions. It's very complicated. And now Cloudflare is telling us, don't worry about regions, deploy to the world. It's simpler. From your experience in working with GraphBase users and customers, is it simpler? Does it provide a better developer experience?
Well, I mean, first, I think Cloudflare is like super innovative, and like they're moving really fast, and they're trying to reimagine, and of course, compete with the giants of the three clouds. But I would say WebAssembly is for sure in its infancy. I would say after 2 years of doing it, I would say it's not an either or. It's not a binary decision whether you should be at the edge or in a single region or in two regions. I think it depends on what you're doing. So like what we've actually started doing now is offering GraphBase on-prem as well, right? So a managed cloud offering where you can run it in a container, which is like, what are you what are you guys doing? But it's more of a, in addition to that, you can also have in the same deployment, you can have, the first request, you might do authentication, caching, personalization, anything like that. That makes sense to have close to the user. But anytime you kind of want to talk to your microservices or databases, there's waterfalling involved. So it doesn't make sense for you to go from, let's say, Stockholm to San Francisco 3 times in the same GraphQL request, if that's where your database is. But it does make sense for you to make that first request to maybe say, hey, you don't have access. Okay, I don't need to go all the way back to the West Coast for that. So what we've done now is we have this hybrid approach where you can have the best of both worlds. So that's our kind of learning after 2 years.
So that sounds like a lot of complexity that you need to deal with because you are figuring out how to deploy to the edge. Does that complexity also translate to your users, or can you hide that from your users?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly want to make it really seamless for the user. You shouldn't have to think about all this stuff. Like you just write your schema. We have an SDK, right? So you can write it. Hopefully it's something that's natural to our users, and then quickly go from that idea or use case to production, right? Without spending time on the infrastructure. And that's something we spend a lot of time in. So, but now the new thing that's coming out soon is the ability to say, hey, I want to deploy to the edge. That's the default. But perhaps you can pin it to a region at the edge. Or, hey, I want to deploy this to GCP, Azure, and AWS, and also add edge caching at the edge. So it's figuring that DX out won't be trivial, but it's really powerful.
So it sounds like you're really delivering a lot of power, but also asking the user, the end developer, to understand a lot of different concepts. Al, we've been talking about GraphQL. TinyBird is all about bringing analytical data into applications. Do you have a GraphQL API for that?
We don't. And I'm probably the least qualified here to talk about anything GraphQL. I don't claim to know much about it, so I am listening intently. No, so I mean, we have focused on REST as our way to expose data. So we take a slightly different approach, I guess, in that we are both the data layer. So we are a database for bringing all of the data, doing the analytics, but then also taking it right through to building the REST APIs through to publication. We kind of handle all of that little bit in the middle, right, of doing like the ORM to turn a query into a REST API so that the user can literally write a SQL query, hit a button, get an API, and not have to do any of that bit in the middle. When we think about DX, most of the improvement that we do when we think about it is like our own platform. We sit there thinking about how do we make our own platform, our own tool, our own library, have super nice DX. But the reality is very few people are working with one tool and one tool only to do what they want to do. And most application stacks are a combination of multiple tools. And that is an area where I think it doesn't get as much attention, right? Because I guess it's a trickier problem to solve because it's potentially lots of external entities, you have less control. But being able to actually improve the DX, not just of your own tool, but of how you work then with other tools as part of a stack, I think is something that we need to start thinking about a bit more.
I love that you mentioned that, this integration between different companies. In the conversation Petra and I had before, we talked about how it used to be that big organization, they had to build an internal development platform. You have a team building that, and they could build a super tightly integrated platform for their application developers. And these days, you can go and get parts of that platform from companies like yourself, from Prisma, and you don't really get the full platform. So you need to pick a few and then bring them together. And that's really what sparked the idea of creating a category and getting all these companies together to start talking about how does this work well together.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space as well because, you look at some of the promises that were made by like cloud vendors when they say, hey, you just come to a cloud vendor and we've got everything, we've got a tool for that, a tool for that, a tool for that.
Yeah.
And it's all one platform. You don't need to go and buy like 6 different tools and integrate them together. But then, the reality is when you actually go and try and use a cloud vendor's native tools for it, you end up picking 6 of their tools. It still feels like you're using 6 different vendors' tools half the time because you still have to put so much work into integrating them all. The cloud vendors tend to not focus on DX really at all. They focus on like powerful features that are very cost effective, but they don't focus on how do we actually push into DX and do that stuff better. And then you actually find that integrating the tools of a cloud vendor tend to be more difficult than integrating the tools from different folks who've actually thought about it a bit more.
That's a really good point, because you have other people that have come up like flight control that will then build on top of AWS. And so really it's just an abstraction, but it's that like we need better DX, and people aren't necessarily finding that with AWS. So they're creating an entirely separate business just for developer experience.
And I think we see that quite a lot. I mean, like Vercel, for an example. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
who isn't deploying with Vercel these days? And it's not like they've come along and done something like insanely new that nobody's ever thought of before. It's basically they're achieving the same job that everybody's been doing before, but just going, actually, all of those other ways of doing it were basically wrong. And like you start using Vercel and you don't sit there going, oh, I need to figure out how to achieve this job with Vercel. It's you start using it and you go, oh, this is the way to do that job, and all the other ways I was doing it were wrong, right? Which is a really like a change in thinking. It's not I need to learn how to use this tool to do this job. It's this tool does this job.
It used to be that one person on the team would have a side project to build the deployment pipeline to put the static files on S3 or something. And of course, it's janky when it's a side project for one person. And then Vercel and Netlify comes along and say, this is the work of an entire company. So they make it really, really smooth.
And I mean, just to double click on that, like that's exactly what we are tempted to do for backend or APIs, right? Like, why does the front end community get such nice tooling, and then you're still sitting there with one staging branch for your whole API, and then Elasticsearch is out of sync, and then there's no previews for anything. It's just it maybe works, I don't remember, and everyone uses the same API. Why should it be like that? Right.
I agree. I mean, I think the back end space, and like particularly as well, like the data space, I mean, has just lagged so far behind in upgrading tooling. Like if you go back 10, 20, 30, 40 years of when data was starting, pretty much all that we have improved is can it scale, right? Is we keep going, we need more data. We need to be able to do queries on bigger amounts of data. Can we make a system that scales better? We've gone from like single user terminals to distributed systems that can handle loads of stuff that have gotten super complex, but the way of working with them is pretty much the same. Like it's never really changed. So they still kind of suck to use, but they scale really well. And it's only in the past, 5 years, I would say ish, give or take, that we've actually started to go, okay, we scale. Maybe it's not a completely solved problem, but I mean, we kind of got there, right? And maybe now one of the bigger problems is it sucks to build this stuff.
When I first discovered Tinybird a couple of years ago, what really attracted me to your product is that you are integrating multiple different systems or concerns. It used to be that you would have a big, expensive data warehouse. That yes, you can run really expensive queries, but they're slow and you really shouldn't run too many of them. You certainly cannot put that in front of your users. So what you have to do is you have to do these background jobs and massage the data and pre-compute and all that mess. And it's a lot of work. And what you're doing is, no, don't do any of that. You can do your queries and then we'll figure out how to make them fast. Can you talk a bit more about that and how that levels up the developer experience?
If you go back to it, I mean, a lot of systems in the analytics space, right, have been built for a completely different purpose, right? They weren't actually built for applications and user-facing stuff. They've been purpose-built for handling reporting and BI and big strategic internal stuff, which kind of has a different set of requirements, right? I mean, people don't really care if it takes that 10 minutes to run a report, or if it takes you a week to actually build the report, because somebody's looking at it once a month, right? So who cares? And they're kind of the tools that we've built for that are fine, right? They're fine. They solve the purpose. And it's now just more recently that we've started to go, well, actually, we're investing millions of dollars every year and buying all of this tool just to be able to store petabytes of data so that we can run a report once a month, or somebody can stick Tableau on it and do a dashboard. And we're starting to realize that actually maybe investing those millions of dollars into doing that is not really worth it. You don't get much of an ROI on that. So what can we do with all of that data that actually generates a bit more revenue? And a lot of that is, well, put it in front of users, build user-facing applications that use that data, all petabytes and petabytes of it. What can we do to make cool stuff? And it's a different class of problem, right? So it needs a different class of tooling, which takes different approaches to doing things, which does also mean different trade-offs to doing things. So it's like we have like switched focus from what previous tooling has done, which, we're not the only ones, right, who have switched focus to try and solve that new problem. There are other people in the space who are also trying to solve that problem. The slightly different approach that we take is that, not many people have shifted their thinking away from, we've changed what we build, but not how we build it, right? We've shifted from saying, hey, we're going to build these big systems for reporting, but we're still going to build this new class of system as if it was a system for reporting, right? And the way of like developers interacting with it, building with it, and working with it is exactly the same. And it just doesn't work when you're building applications, because applications move so much faster. Users want features like every day. You've got time to market that you actually care about because there's revenue attached to those features. It's not just when it arrives next month. It's get that feature out now because it's holding up money. It's a change in thought of how we build them. And that's what we're focusing on, right? We're as fast and as scalable as the other people working in this space. But the area we're trying to innovate on is DX, right? And how do we actually make developers more productive than they used to be?
So you're taking DX and you're putting it to the top of the priority stack. Are there other things that are falling to the side because of that? Are there trade-offs?
Not really. I mean, the nice model that we've gone for, which I think most people really are going for these days, is basically like the kind of the open core model, right? Where the bit in the middle that we use as the database that powers our platform is ClickHouse, which is an open source database. There's a huge community about it. So we are contributors to it. Loads of other companies, including like Cloudflare that we spoke about earlier, are contributors to it that are helping to build it to be a scalable, performant platform. And so, we don't want to just take from that. We are contributing to it, but we benefit collectively from everybody else's work at the same time, so that we can do some percentage of effort into building performance and scale, but then direct all of the rest of that effort to building DX to help developers.
On the other panel, we talked about the importance of positioning yourself within an existing ecosystem. So GraphBase, you're doing GraphQL. It's a GraphQL ecosystem. If people want to do GraphQL, they can use GraphBase. Tinybird is built on ClickHouse, which is an amazingly powerful analytics database. But I'm not sure application developers want to write ClickHouse queries. And you have a REST API. Are you asking developers to submit ClickHouse queries over REST, or do you have a better way for developers to interact with this?
Yeah, it is a tricky mix, right? Because when you think of particularly back-end developers, quite often they're focused more on code and deployment of things rather than on like writing SQL and doing analytics, writing queries and stuff.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of a mix, right? And we do end up working not just with like back-end and application developers, but with data engineering teams, right? Who might own the platform itself and the ingestion and the queries. But the nice thing is that like when you're building data-driven applications, right, you've always got this handoff of you've got some people who own the data bit and you've got some people who own the application-y bit and the back-end bit. And there's a handoff between them, which means you've got, a gap in knowledge and transferring the knowledge between the two teams. Yeah. You've got one team does something and then has got to wait a week for the next team to prioritize it and finish it. Whereas we try and get rid of that and say, well, it's all one platform. And basically the data team can write the query from the requirements of the application team, hit a button, get an API and say, it's gone. We don't need to raise a ticket, hand it over, it's done.
So you're facilitating the handover, the collaboration between those two different fractions in the company.
Yeah, basically just trying to find areas of efficiency where you don't need to do as many handovers, right? So it just saves a lot of time.
Jamie, I would like your thoughts on developer experience and this idea of taking that and putting that on the top of the priority list. I feel like Redwood has taken developer experience and put it on the top. And do you see any trade-offs? Are there issues your users are experiencing because of that?
I think developer experience is probably one of your best tools for marketing, because not only does it make things seamless, but then it makes it a pleasure and a delight to actually use something. And so I really appreciate Redwood and some of the opinions that have been made. And I think if anything that has kind of fallen to the wayside is just that we have made strong opinions. And so that makes our developer experience fantastic, but that also means that you have to kind of fall in line with the opinions that we've made. Some of the things that we're working on right now with the next version will open that up a little bit more. So for example, right now we're very strongly tied to GraphQL. And if you don't want to use GraphQL, you could just use Redwood as a front end layer, or you could use Redwood as just a back end layer. But if you want to use the front end and the back end together, then you have to use GraphQL. But with React Server Components and some of the things that we're looking at there, that will be more open and you won't necessarily be tied to GraphQL. So I think that's probably the only thing, is if you don't necessarily want to abide by the opinions and the structure that we've provided, if you want to make those decisions or kind of go off to the side, I think that's the only thing that kind of maybe rubs people, not necessarily the wrong way, but not necessarily like falls in line with what they want to do.
It sounds like what you're describing is the Ruby on Rails philosophy. Like this is how we do it, and you don't need all different ways to achieve the same thing.
Yeah. For me, one of the initial lures to Redwood was that they had made the same decisions that I would have made anyways. And so it was like, well, why not go this direction? Because this is the exact same stack that I would use. But I do understand if you're trying to pull in other things, how that could be more difficult, or if you want to experiment or see how things would work in another ecosystem or try a new technology, then that becomes difficult to do with Redwood as it is right now. But again, as we move forward, that will open up more.
You all have talked a bit about some developer experience principles, basically abstracting away complexity, making decisions easier. What would you all think the most important benefits are to these users who want a better DX? What does good DX look like? What do you find the most important in good DX, and how do you go about that on a day-to-day? What challenges are you solving? What solutions are you liking, especially to make that great DX possible?
I think for us at Redwood, a lot of it is just taking away the monotony. Like I mentioned our code generators earlier, like having to rewrite the same code over and over again, like that's not fun. That's really boring. Or it seems like every application needs some type of CRUD. Like that's really boring. I would rather work on more interesting problems. And a lot of that CRUD stuff can be formulaic. And so why not automate that? So that's been a huge part of our developer experience, is taking those monotonous pieces so that you can focus on more interesting challenges. Another piece is just consistency and naming. I know that sounds silly and dumb, but it makes you have more expected behavior when you're like, I know it's named like this over here, so we should have a similar naming pattern. And it's hilarious in a not funny way how much time we spend in core team meetings just talking about naming things so that that piece is intuitive.
I love that part. What you're basically saying is making decisions is great, but make decisions about the important stuff, and all the other stuff, just have the system take care of it.
Exactly.
And I love that piece on naming consistency, of that it does sound really silly, but it's not until you actually run into a thing where you've got, like 4 different names for one thing that you realize how much time you waste talking about the same thing and then misunderstanding each other.
Part of the reason, I agree, naming consistency is probably the number one thing for me. That's part of the reason why I like GraphQL and we chose it, because it is a standard. We use REST APIs as well, of course. This is not a REST versus GraphQL, but it is nice to have a standard that's widely adopted, that's strongly typed, and documentation is first class. So that's part of the reason we picked it. But the other thing I want to add is also, for us, it's really like time to market, right? Like how can we help developers move faster by taking away, monotonous things, but also to make them go faster, right? Like just the feedback cycle of developing a feature, of getting a production PR to production, we think we can help there. And I think that's what really excites me.
So rather than thinking of GraphBase as a backend as a service, is it more appropriate to think of it as a GraphQL API gateway?
Yeah, or a full stack GraphQL platform where everything is serverless and the number one focus is developer experience.
So if you think about how developers are building these data-driven applications, when you think about how someone would get started today, these developer experience improvements probably have a pretty big impact. Do you have any thoughts around how that has changed in the last few years?
There was very little, and Frederick touched on this earlier, right? There was very little workflow around building that kind of stuff. People kind of stuck a database up and then wrote a couple of bit of ad hoc SQLs, and sometimes that would live on people's laptops, and that's where it would stay. And it was quite easy to get lost. And obviously there was no versioning, so you could go and write a data model that would live in your database. And how do you version that? How do you do changes and control that? And I mean, even still today, that's not a solved problem. People are still trying to work that out. But there are more of us now actually trying to look at that problem and start to bring a lot of the software engineering principles that are very common on the front end side and everywhere else in software into the data side of things, so that you can push your data project into Git. You can have an automatic CI/CD process that has got regression tests and everything built into it, and then when you add a PR, it clones everything into a separate environment so that you can run tests on it, and then when you're done, you can just merge the PR, and then automatically behind the scenes it tries to merge that into production. And you kind of think, well, why did we not do that sooner on data? I mean, it's a very, very hard thing to do, particularly when you're doing data at scale, because to be able to test a new model, to be able to test your queries, you need some data to be able to test it against. And if it's very high volume, it's hard to just go and copy that and stick that into a test environment. But I think that's the main thing, particularly for like the data backend side, is where it's going to change. And that's like something that we've been doing recently in Tinybird, is we've now got basically that flow of being able to connect everything to Git, version it all, do PRs, CI/CD, and all that.
So it sounds like you're talking about preview environments, like we know them from Netlify and Vercel and Heroku before that. Do you have that in Tinybird? How does it work? How do you deal with the fact that there's so much data?
So it's a really tricky one. And the approach we've landed on for now is basically to give the user control. So you can either say, clone all my resources and just here's a static file and load those, or you can say go to production and take this slice, this partition of data, and move that across into my test environment. Or, and this is, the dangerous option is take everything from production and copy it in, which if you're at high scale, don't do it. But if if you've got relatively low data rates, then it's kind of fine. That's how we're doing that at the moment, and yet to be seen. It may turn out to be the wrong approach. We don't know. It's just not a solved problem yet, and that's where we've landed so far.
I think another big difference between like the last 5-10 years is that composable architecture that we were talking about earlier. For somebody new coming into tech, you have to learn so many different services. And especially if you're trying to build your own stack, you have to make all those decisions yourself. You have to be able to evaluate, should I go REST? Should I go GraphQL? Should I do this or that? And I remember when I was first learning, I would have a tab open for every different type of stack. And I would have to search through the documentation through like 6 tabs because I wouldn't be sure what like the error was throwing, like what service is throwing this error. And so it makes it difficult as a new developer coming in now to be able to keep all of that straight. And in some ways, I think in the past, it was a little bit easier because you did have more of a select stack or everything was all encompassing. But as we've tried to specialize on things, it's become a little bit harder sometimes to parse that. But I think like in most cases, the pendulum will swing one way or the other. People will specialize and then they'll kind of generalize. And I think right now we're kind of in that more specialized, compose, give people options, highlight the user, and let them pick the best service for the best job.
So I talk a bit about this idea that our industry is expanding rapidly, and that means that there's a lot of investment going into it. There are a lot of companies springing up and a lot of stacks appearing, and that's great because there's a lot of innovation, there's improvement to the developer experience. But it's also challenging because it used to be that you had to pick between Ruby on Rails and Python, maybe PHP. Now there's so many options. As a new developer, what should you do? What are your recommendations?
They go to the basics, start with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and that will get you 90% of the way there because a lot of the other things are built on those or they're going to use them. So even if you are using, say, PHP or Python or Rails, you're still going to use HTML and CSS and JavaScript to do some of those pieces. And also your knowledge of JavaScript will also help transfer to some of these other languages. The syntax will look different because, for example, there might not be a bracketed language, but at least the way that you think about code and the way that you process and solve problems, that translates regardless of what language or technology you're using.
Frederick, do you have thoughts on how GraphBase is approachable for people new to the field of software development?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question. Something we've been discussing a lot lately, especially with this kind of Twitter sphere of React server components where people are kind of questioning, hey, do you need an API? And that's maybe not the first few weeks or months of a project, but eventually you probably will need an API. So it's really interesting to see how we kind of come full circle and people think, oh, finally we can move away from this REST versus GraphQL discussion. But yeah, I mean, I'm more of like going back to the real question is fundamentals. I agree. Like, let's not forget it is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you are delivering. So it helps to understand what you're doing. But I would say like API first is still a thing. And I think it's really, really powerful to have that from the beginning, just as a mindset for the whole project and team you're building things with. And just this like API economy and if everything is an API internally as you scale, it becomes much easier to manage as well. But also I wanted to address the other thing about what's changed in the last 5-10 years. I would say people are much more kind of willing to adopt managed services today compared to maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. You had to convince a bunch of people like, oh, why? I mean, the cloud is no longer a discussion point, but a managed service, especially for ClickHouse, like no way that would have happened 5 or 10 years ago. Now it's just like, okay, you want real-time dashboards? Okay, what's out there? Tinybird. All right, let's try it. And then in a few weeks, you have it up and running, or maybe even days with a credit card. Like that is revolutionary. That did not exist before. So like starting a company today, I mean, ChatGPT aside, like you can go quite far alone if you know what you're doing. And if you're 2-3 people, you can go so much faster compared to just a few years ago.
So what you're touching on there is that the proliferation of these high-level services, they can deliver so much value with very little effort. And that means even as a new developer, you can go and make use of those services and you can build something meaningful, something that is exciting for you personally, but also something that deliver real value in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the time to market is dramatically reduced, and also you're spending time on building the product instead of infrastructure. So it's a win-win.
I think that's fascinating because it means that developers can really focus on how they provide value, and they can focus on what they want to get done instead of focusing on how to scale this thing, how do I name this thing, which database do I need, how do I do these things that are really just tools for me to get done that application that I want to get out there. If you all think about the developer experience improvements that have been happening and that you might be expecting to happen, how else do you think these data-driven applications will change in the future? What else will these improvements enable for developers?
You're asking us to predict the future.
I think some of the things that are interesting right now is that so many apps are just CRUD based. You're just creating, reading, and updating, deleting data. And in some ways, that's just a glorified Excel sheet. But where it starts to get really interesting and where you need these custom applications is the inferences that you can make from the data. And so, like, it's really interesting to hear what you're talking about with Tinybird and analytics, because all of a sudden then it's not just data, it's not just a number, but it's like, what does this number mean? And so it'll be interesting to see in the next 5 or 10 years, especially like with ChatGPT, or I see this even with like Notion AI, where I can ask Notion based on my workspace a question and it will be able to give me that answer. That stuff is really interesting. And, I can see with the rise of AI where that might lead to.
A question for all of you. Are any of you thinking about how to make use of this new AI stuff? Are you building AI into Tinybird or GraphBase? Does Redwood have a take on how you should do vector search or anything like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be wrong for us to not have thought about it and have an opinion. It's an interesting one because a lot of people have jumped onto it very, very quickly and gone, hey, we need to do something with it, and kind of like forced it in, and it's not necessarily always been in a fantastically valuable way. And so we've started to explore, like, given the biggest drawback or downside to AI at the moment is trust, right? It can do some fantastic things, but you can't always 100% trust what it outputs. So we've tried to avoid putting it into like mission critical workflows of, you can't just say, go and do this thing, and then it goes out and takes production down. So we've tried to look at ways where you could bring it into areas where if it does something wrong, it doesn't really matter. So earlier in the year, last year, I built a like fake data generator, because that's like one of the painful things in data. You try and do a POC, you don't have any data to work with, so you generate some fake data. And then it was, hey, AI is around, and even using a fake data generator, it's kind of annoying to have to configure it. So actually, could you use AI just to configure a fake data generator? And now we have a natural language prompt, so you can say, I'm working on a POC and I want to be able to do some analytics over some financial transactions so that I can build analytics to work out something, right? And you can just type that into a prompt, hit go, and it will try and create a fake schema that says, these are your columns, these are their types, generate some fake data, and then stream it into a table, like as a constant real-time stream, so that you can start prototyping against it. If it messes up, doesn't matter, right? It's not mission critical, but it's a bit of a time saver for prototyping. And then it's, where do we go from there? Like, is it capable yet of being like a data engineering co-pilot? I don't know. I've some people believe so. I'm a bit more cynical on whether it's ready for that yet. It's going to get there.
So is this something that you're already building into the Tinybird product, or is it more of a side project, a hack?
The AI data generator is already in production. It's already in the product. Exactly. You can go and play with it. So it already works. We use it quite a lot for going and testing stuff, particularly, as I say, it's like great for like demos or new users that come along and just say, hey, I want to try something out, or existing users say, hey, I don't want to load like a CSV of all of my other data because I just want to see if this actually works, like just to prove it in the first place. So it just really lowers that friction to be able to say, hey, actually, is this worth investing into?
We should have that for Prisma. Amy, would that be relevant for Redwood at all if Prisma CLI could auto-generate a data model for you?
Especially when it comes to prototyping and trying to move faster. To go back to your original question about how we're thinking about AI, right now we're just leaning on other services. So Fixie AI is a great service to be able to integrate AI within your application. It helps you do chatbots and things like that. There's also AI JSX, which is part of Fixie. It's really interesting, but we haven't looked at in terms of having AI write code or be a first-class citizen inside Redwood.
Speaking of AI writing code, the question I get sometimes is, will there be software developers in the future? Will we still be relevant? Do people need Prisma? The AI is just going to do all of this for us.
Right now, I think you'd still need developers. And the way that I'm using it is more of like a true co-pilot. I'm editing code more than I'm necessarily writing code. So GitHub Copilot will make a suggestion, or even I was using GitHub Copilot the other week with Prisma, where I was saying, hey, you can see my data model. This is what I'm trying to get my query to do. What should it look like? And it will generate that for me. And then I can edit it and revise it. But right now it's more of like a sidekick piece. It'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward in the future. But I feel like you almost always need that check to see, did this write what I wanted it to do? Is this the most efficient way? Like, where is it actually pulling that code from? Is the database or the code that it's referencing, is that really the best implementation of what I'm trying to do?
Petra, with that, I think we have a wrap.
Absolutely, I think so. This has been amazing. It was really cool to hear all the insights from all of you and just hear more about the different aspects of what do you think the good DX looks like and these improvements to building data-driven applications.
What an amazing day. I learned so much, and I hope you got some good insight into what data DX is. I want to thank all of the speakers who came here today, and to all of you who tuned in, thank you.